Very warm welcome to Doug, who's come along to tell us today about a very sort of niche, interesting area. He is Managing Director of FWT, which is an information design consultancy that specialises in transport information. He joined there in 1979,
yes.
Originally a specialist in transport mapping, but he's got a deep interest in typography, signage and information design and print in public transport applications. So he's designed, produced and managed wayfinding systems for city centres and new bus stations at Derby, Leicester, Wolverhampton, Cardiff, Swansea, Warrington and about 20 other smaller ones. So I guess he knows what he's talking about. And has acted as a consultant and designer for TfL and London Transport, and designed and produced many complex track diagrams and maps for London Underground Control Centre. Is presently project managing a new signage system in the grounds of the Middle Temple just down the road. And I think you said that you've just recently published a book.
I've recently published my historical underground map.
Okay.
That's, yes, I've done other books as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that is available for sale if anyone's stuck for a Christmas present. Yeah. So please do speak to Doug afterwards. But anyway, today he's going to talk about London bus blinds, and it's a key bit of information that really, if you think about it, without it, basically transport would be in chaos. It's something that we really take for granted. Well, it's to be honest, I hadn't really thought about it before.
No.
But Doug is going to discuss the design challenges and how these are addressed. And I really am looking forward to finding out a little more. So, very warm welcome, Doug, and over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. What I don't want to do is start using jargon, so I hate the thing. If I come up with any expressions that anybody thinks I don't know what you're talking about, please stop and tell me. Does everybody know what a bus blind is before we start? Because it's that thing on the front of the bus that tells you where it's going. And on a normal bus it would have a route number on it. They're printed roller blinds. There are experiments going on at the moment which I'm very keen on to have them as electronic displays, because at the moment they're not. Huge challenges with that. The other thing that I need to say is that context is so important in any kind of graphic design. It doesn't matter what it is. You're really going to have to use your imagination tonight, because everything I'm showing you is so completely out of context. You've got to bear in mind that you'll normally see a bus out in the street and it's rattling towards you. You're not seeing it square on, it'll be at an angle, it's gradually getting nearer, the light might be hopeless. All those things I can't demonstrate. So there may be some aspects of what I'm saying, you might be thinking, well, what's the problem? But try and imagine what we're going to be looking at as if you're actually out in the street. There are all sorts of devices available on the internet and on phones and all manner of things that tell people how to get where they want to go. But the point is, even if you know which bus that you're going to catch and you know where you're trying to get to, unless it's displayed on the front of the bus when it turns up, you've got no certainty that you're actually getting on the right bus. Now, there's a school of thought, and I do have some sympathy with it, that people don't even look at them. Habitual travellers probably don't. That's something to take in. Now, bear in mind that according to various TfL statistics, it's said that there's about 6.5 million journeys a day made on buses in London, and every one of them, in theory, will start by you looking at the front of the bus. So it's quite important that you can actually read the thing. There are all sorts of problems with modern bus design which I can't do anything about. Most notably is that modern buses have a very curved front, and the glass is curved, and you get all manner of problems with reflection, which I can't really demonstrate on here. It's a big problem, and no matter how good the typography is, it's not going to solve that one. That's an important thing to take into account. And as I say, I don't want to assume that you know what I'm talking about, so just to get this out of the way, there's two different blind boxes on the front of that bus. One's carrying the route number and one's telling you where the bus is going to end up. Doesn't tell you any intermediate points, which is a different problem. they're separate roller blinds, and one of the problems that I was asked to address, that I'd actually drew it to the attention of the Managing Director of TfL Surface Transport, that's a good example. That Hackney Central, I believe, is quite difficult to read. Now bear in mind you're looking at it and it's not moving, but the letters are far too close to one another, and they've also been slightly squashed in width to get it to fit, because the blind box actually isn't wide enough. The route number's fine, there's only 2 numbers, so that fits. So that's a typical front, and here's a close-up of it, just for the avoidance of doubt, you know what I'm talking about. So there's another blind box on the back of the bus, which only has the route number. There's nothing else on the back. Here's a modern bus side, and again you've got the blind box on the side. Having said that, on the front of the bus you've got 2 separate roller blinds, place name, route number. On the side, that's 1 blind. So the 9 and the Hammersmith is all on one display on its own. When you turn it over, you'll still get 9, but it'll be going somewhere else. That's here's again a close-up of one of them. There's been a lot of conversations that I can't get into here because my brief was very clear. People think you can't get better contrast than black and white, and that's true, you can't, but contrast isn't the be-all and end-all of visibility. But actually they are not black and white. The white isn't white. Through glass and with reflection it's actually very light grey, and the black isn't black, it's actually quite dark grey, so that isn't very good contrast. But there's nothing much I can do about that. Right, well, as I said, context. So we need to consider when you're looking at a blind that the lighting will vary enormously day or night, and the weather conditions have an impact on it. The angle that you're looking up at it, the angle you're looking at the side at it, and also the fact that the vehicle's moving towards you. They're just 5 things that affect the importance of the typography and the clarity of the layout. It's an immutable maxim of the retail trade: location, 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 and you can't argue with that. You can have a wonderful shop. If it's down a back street where nobody sees it, you're not going to do much trade, which is why rents are so high for premium locations. But in our world of typography, my maxim is always spacing, spacing, spacing. You can use excellent typefaces, you can produce them at exactly the right size, and if the spacing's not right, it actually can make it very difficult to read. I don't know whether anybody here has anything to do with book production, but you can wreck the legibility of any page on a book by actually making the lines too close together, or having the actual column of text too narrow or too wide, if the margins aren't right, and if the spacing between the words and between the letters isn't optimal, it kills the legibility. It's crucial. It's the most important part of all of this. Can everybody read that?
Yes, well.
It's actually not difficult, is it?
It takes a bit longer.
Yes, a little bit, but actually it's not a problem. So you might think, well, what the hell does it matter whether the spacing's right? If humans are amazingly good at making the best of something that's terrible, but they're only good at making the best of something that's terrible if they're familiar with it. Now we can all read that because it's in English. If that was in a language you weren't familiar with, or there were words in there that you weren't familiar with, you wouldn't be able to read it. But researchers, as you can see, you only need the first and the last letter to be right, and do what you like in between, because we actually read words as a complete entity. We don't read the letters, which is another reason why the spacing is so important. Right, I just need to give some background as to what I'm going to tell you about bus blinds. And I don't know, I know looking around this audience there'll be several people who know exactly who Edward Johnston is, but for those of you who don't, just bear with me. He was a calligrapher. He was hired in 1913 by what was then the chairman of the Underground Group. This is long before the days of London Transport. It had nothing to do with buses at all. It was purely the Underground. And they felt there was a distinct need to have a typeface that was clear for use on posters. That was what it was for. It very soon graduated into being used for signage as well. Edward Johnston, he was not a type designer. He'd never designed a typeface in his life before then. but he came up with something which I think is absolutely exquisite. And I know it's an old cliche, fitness for purpose, but boy did he achieve it. And we're still using it in various forms even today. That's just a few examples of some letters from Johnston's original underground type. And for those of you who are not familiar with type, I've just put on there some explanations of the bits and pieces that actually make up a typeface. We're all familiar with what a capital letter is. That's obvious. It's known as the cap height. Where you've got letters like a P or a G, the bit that goes down below the baseline is called a descender. That's quite important for what's coming up soon. And the bits that are poking up from the lowercase d is called an ascender. And the bit that's left in between, which I've shown there as the X height, it's not quite true what I'm about to say, but it will do. It's the only letter that has a square top and bottom of a lowercase letter with no ascender and no descender, and consequently that whole part of the typeface is called the X height. It's very important to get the proportion of that right relative to the size of the capitals, and also taking into account the ascenders and descenders. What Johnston came up with after a lot of experimentation and looking at a lot of typefaces going back hundreds of years, back to Roman times, was that he ended up with a proportion of 7 to 1 for a capital I. And he found that for the purposes of designing a poster typeface, it doesn't work for others, that was the optimum proportion. He then also worked out how big a lowercase o could be to define the X height, so that the thickness of the stroke, which is the black part of the letter, relative to the hole in the middle, was just right. Now, if you made that hole in the middle of the O smaller, what you're doing is thickening up the letter. And the more you thicken that up, the more impossible it becomes to read eventually. So he came up with these proportions of 1 to 7 and the optimum size of an O, which dictated the X height, and based the whole alphabet on that. He tried to make every letter as uniform as possible, and therein comes the ultimate type designer's paradox, because every letter in an alphabet, the capitals, the lowercase, the numerals, the punctuation, they all have to conform to a family feel. They've all got to look as though they're part of the same typeface. If you mixed a letter from, say, Times Roman with Helvetica in a word, it would look nonsense. So you have to get that family feel. Of course, if you take that to the obvious extreme, every letter in the alphabet will look identical. That's no good. So we need to end up with 26 capitals, 26 lowercase letters, about 30 punctuation marks that all look instantly very different, but still looking part of the family feel. It's ever so difficult, trust me. And I've just given a couple of examples there of comparing. On the bottom line, you've got Johnston's lowercase a and o. This is a typeface called Futura, as it happens. And from a distance and in reading quickly, that a and the o are actually very similar. It's very well known in psychological circles that the most mistakes are made when you're in a hurry. It doesn't matter what you do, and it's certainly true with reading, and it's very easy to make reading mistakes if the letters are too uniform. And it's one of the problems with Futura and a number of others. In the bottom right, I've got a capital I and a lowercase l, and they look nothing like one another. In Futura, there's very little difference, and in the context of words, it's very easy to really misinterpret what you're reading. People often muse about what they call this hockey stick shape on Johnston's lowercase l and think it's all a bit quirky. But actually, it had two purposes. One, it doesn't look like anything else. You can't confuse it with any other letter. But it also stops you spacing the next letter too near. Bear in mind, for signage and for posters, you don't want tight spacing. It's a disaster if you space things too tightly. So I'll come on to what's gone wrong, because we're using Johnston on bus blinds, so why has it all gone wrong? On the left is a synopsis of Johnston's original, what nowadays would be called medium. We didn't have any of that nonsense in those days. That's his original alphabet. It was designed in uppercase, lowercase, numerals, punctuation. I've left the punctuation off there. And I started off with what I was doing by looking at his original design drawings, many of which are in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it gave a fascinating insight into how he constructed the letters, because superficially you think, well, what's all the fuss about? They're all really simple letter forms. They're actually deceptively not at all. I mean, just a little example, with his figure 8, where it meets in the middle, the stroke is actually slightly pinched left and right. If you kept that stroke width uniform all the way round, you end up with a bit too much black in the middle, and it looks too fat. He made all sorts of subtle little adjustments that made it, in my view, just right. I won't trouble you with the fact that he was asked to do a bold version many years later. It's not really part of this. But he was also asked in 1922, by which time the underground group had got a bit larger, and they bought up quite a lot of the buses companies that were running in London. And there was a problem, you guessed it, with destination displays on the front of buses. Problem being was that the destination display area wasn't big enough, and the letters wouldn't fit, and the way they'd been done looked a bit of a mess. So Johnston was again asked, would he come up with what they called a root board variant of his typeface. It was later altered subtly by Harry Carter, who was also a very good type designer in 1939, but that's actually Harry Carter's root board typeface. So when he designed his what we call root board typeface, his driving force with all of his letter forms was to keep things as uniform as possible, but make every letter look as different as possible. And to keep that uniformity, getting the balance of curves was crucially important to all this. When you then want to have a variant of it that's much narrower, which today we call condensed, which I'll come back to later on, he felt it was very important to retain that uniformity of shape. So if you look at the top of his capital P and his capital R, it's still got as uniform a curve for your eye to negotiate as easily as possible. And you can see that in the standard typeface and in the condensed, the X height's still the same. But what he's had to do is slightly move the bowl, which is the enclosed area of the P and the R, upwards, which you can see by following the little pink lines that I've put on there. I've shown it again down the bottom to get rid of all the visual clutter. That's what he came up with, and that's what's been used on current bus blinds. I think bus blinds started in 1938, something like that. Before that, the letters were actually painted on wood and varnished and whatever, all sorts of complicated things were going on. So what we've got are those two options to use on bus blinds. That's it. There was nothing else in existence. When I had a drink after work with some of you will know the name Leon Daniels. He's Managing Director Surface Transport of TfL now, and somebody who's very attuned to all this sort of thing. And when I said to him, Leon, the blooming bus blinds are really getting bad. And what do you mean, Doug? And we went out in the street and we stood on a street corner for a quarter of an hour. We didn't get arrested, so that was good. And I was pointing out as buses were going past, that one's all right, that one's all right. Look at that, that's dreadful. And he got it straight away. And basically said to me that he wanted me to do something about it. Now, the principles I've always worked to, this isn't original to me, I'm not taking any credit for this, the 4 Ds, discover, define, design and deliver. To get rid of the jargon, discover is, first of all, you need to find out what the problem is. There's an awful lot of design projects fail because people dash off and they come up and they've designed this, that and the other. They don't actually know what it was they were trying to solve. You've got to actually look at what's there in the first place, and by that analysis be able to say, I can see what the problem is, now I know what to do. That's when you start designing. You don't do designing at the beginning. When you've done the designing, that's when you start your rollout program, which I call implementation. That's the bit that usually goes wrong because that's when the client gets involved. Right, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, never mind. You I don't know if people are familiar with the Disability Discrimination Act. We'll just call it DDA for now, which is what it's most known at. It's a set of guidelines that has government backing, I believe. It's very extensive and it deals with all manner of disability and discrimination aspects. The only bit that I'm talking about here is their recommendation on lettering for bus blinds. It's pages and pages long, it's a book this thick. And these are their actual words from their guidelines. They're not rules to be slavishly followed, which is what actually happens. But it says that characters of not less than 125 millimetres in height, those of you who are my sort of age will know that's 5 inches, which is where it's actually come from, is the minimum height for the front of the vehicle. So that's our destination. The ones on the side, the route numbers mustn't be less than 70 millimetres in height. Then it says lowercase lettering in Helvetica, Arial and other sans serif fonts are easiest to read. Does everybody know what sans serif means? You're all familiar with that? Fine. If you want to find out why I dislike Helvetica so much and Arial even more, you'll have to have a look on my website. I've done a fairly lengthy article. Helvetica's far too uniform and the excite's too big, and I think it's very difficult to read. It's often used when it shouldn't. It does have its place, but we'll leave that. This bold statement that sans serif fonts are easier to read is actually contestable, because it doesn't say in what circumstances. I'll go back to context. There are loads of situations where, without question, upper and lowercase is what you want.
Isn't that why newspapers use like Times New Roman, because it's so much easier to follow? Which is a serif font.
It depends on the context. For bookwork, I would never use sans serif. It's awful. Signage, yes, but it depends on the circumstances. There's no one answer to any typography or signage question. Any question, the answer will be, it depends. There are many situations where capitals work far better, and there's many situations where capitals are a disaster. You need to know what you're doing. And then they say, rather unhelpfully, that it's important that ascenders and descenders are not squashed, since this will make shape recognition more difficult. That bottom line about shape recognition is absolutely right. What they're not clear on when they say squashed is what do they mean. They're actually referring to does everybody know what a dot matrix sign is? Yeah? You often see dot matrix lettering where there is nothing below the baseline, in other words, where the bottom of the capital letters are. So a lowercase p, they shove it up, and then you can't tell it's a p anymore, or it's very indistinct. That's what they're talking about, but they don't refer to squashing width. In fact, they don't actually say what they're squashing at all. It's very well-meaning. I wouldn't want to demean them in any way, but it's very unhelpful, and it's unfortunately being interpreted a lot these days by people who actually don't understand it. Everybody's got a Mac or a PC now, and they think we'll just do the typing, that's it. There's a bit more to typography than that. So we'll come back. I just wanted to put that up again just to remind you, in case you'd forgotten, what I was talking about excite, ascenders and descenders. Now, when they say squashed, they actually mean distorted. There are many typefaces which are called condensed, and that's a very different matter altogether. And they're not interchangeable expressions. And I've just given you an example there. The top line of the word to is Johnston's, we'll call it medium for now. The middle line is still Johnston medium, but what I've done is I've squashed the width of it, so it's 50% narrower than it should be. And what you can see that happens there is the crossbar of the T is still the same thickness as it was, but the vertical stroke is now half the width it should be. The O's gone a bit bonkers, as you can see, the shape of it. Nobody would ever design a letter form like that, other than Antique Olive, I think. That's not the way to, if something doesn't fit the width and you need a condensed face, what you should never do is squash a medium typeface. If you're doing that, you're either using the wrong point size or a wrong typeface, or the context is wrong. What you've got underneath there is the word to in one of the condensed typefaces that I've ended up designing for this job. and as you can see, the T is still a uniform stroke vertically and horizontally, and likewise the O is still full width, left and right, as opposed to half width. It's again helping shape recognition and keeping the spacing right. So does that make sense to people? What I've shown at the top is Johnston's ordinary lettering, where I haven't done anything with it other than type it out and space it properly. The next line down, and we'll come on to this shortly, is still the same letter forms. I haven't altered the shapes of the letters at all, but what I've done is I've reduced the letter spacing. Letter spacing is the space between the letters. It's nothing to do with the words, it's between each letter in the word, and they're far too close now, especially on the front of a bus when it's rattling towards you. If you get something with a lowercase rn, it looks like an M. I'll demonstrate that later on. And then the next one down is wrecking it even more, where I've taken the letter spacing out and squashed the letters, which is actually what's happening on our bus blinds at the moment, which is why they're, I believe, much more difficult to read. And the bottom one is my mildly condensed version that is correctly spaced to my eye. And you'll see there's more space between the letters on the bottom line than there is on the one above, though they're actually taking up the same space overall as a word. But the definition of each letter form is the important bit, and that's why spacing is so important. Remember, if you're reading it in a hurry, you get it wrong. Now, this is to the right proportions, it's not the right size. If I did it the right size, it would be twice as big as that. That's a typical front destination blind on a modern bus, and using Johnston for Highbury Barn, you can see it doesn't fit. And what's been done up until recently is they've taken some of the letter spacing out, that didn't help, they then squashed the letters a little bit, and you can see what's happened to the RN. We're all sitting in a comfortable, well-lit room, and you can probably think, well, I can read that all right. But believe me, it's a lot more difficult out in the street. So, what Leon said to me was, we need to do something about this. He wanted me to go and visit a company called McKenna Brothers, who are in Manchester. They are the people that manufacture all the bus blinds for London. They're printed through a quite complicated process on huge roller blinds, and they, in my view, do a wonderful job. Their printing is superb. But as I explained to McKenna's when we went up there, they're actually in an impossible position with what they're being asked to do. Because when names don't fit, and at least 50% of them don't, that's how bad the problem is. One solution is, well, don't use Johnston. Use a different typeface that's condensed and suitable for the job. But London Transport and now TfL will not permit that. It's their corporate typeface. That's what they want to use, and I applaud them for it because I think it's wonderful, but it's been buggered up, basically. The other solution would be, well, let's have a wider blind box, and then we don't have to worry about spoiling the lettering. There aren't any, and they wouldn't fit the bus even if they did, because it's not part of the bus design. That's a different problem. The other solution would be, well, keep Johnston, set it properly, have the right spacing, and reduce the type size so it will fit. And then it doesn't comply with DDA because it's not the right height. So whatever McKenna's wanted to do, they couldn't. So the actual problem is you need a different typeface. So what Leon said to me, he said, I want you to go away, I want the displays to be clear and unambiguous, and he said, I want them to be aesthetically pleasing. Now, this was a great insight into Leon's understanding of this, because most people don't think about aesthetics when it comes to all this, but actually in typography it's very important. I've got a book that I really want to read at home, and I can't get past about page 30 because the typesetting and the choice of the typeface is so bad. Reading fatigue sets in so quickly, I just give up with it. I can't read it. I added in the bottom bit. It's been said, and it's quite right, that upper and lowercase is much easier to read from the point of view that the words have shapes, whereas with capitals they really don't have much of a shape, it all looks the same. So when I showed you all that jumbled up lettering right near the beginning and you could all read it, that's because you're actually familiar with the words. We've got an awful lot of people who visit London, and not necessarily people from other countries, you know, even people that might come down from Birmingham or whatever and are not familiar with place names in London. No, they can't read those upper and lowercase names because they're not familiar with them. Their brain doesn't go like that and get the name. That's why you've got to be able to read it easily. So this is what I ended up coming up with. Actually, this isn't quite true because I started doing this about 10 years ago for my own amusement. I just wanted to see if I could intellectually come up with a suite of typefaces that would do the job. And it was that Leon actually latched onto and decided he wanted me to finish the job off. So the top line that shows Hammersmith and Wimbledon Broadway is in standard Johnston. The second line down is a version of it that I've designed that still sticks to Johnston's principles in making the letter shapes as smooth as possible, easy for your eye to negotiate, but slightly narrower. So the O in my Wimbledon Broadway, you can see, isn't a perfect circle, but it does have a uniform stroke width all the way around the O, and the letter spacing is maintained. There were, as I showed you at the beginning, the root board condensed version of Johnston that was designed back in 1922. You've got to bear in mind, forget everything you know about typesetting now with computers because it's just got no bearing on where we were then. As I say, they were all either painted onto wood or a lot of it was done by cutting letters out of bits of paper and gluing them onto the wood and then varnishing over the top to protect it from the weather. So you might have 5 capital A's on a root board for umpteen different names and they would all be completely different. There was no uniformity. So I went back to the original 1938 blinds, which had an awful lot of variation in them as well. And I decided that although we got this, what they called root board condensed typeface, what we actually wanted is 2 variants of it. So I've done one that, I call that medium, I call that condensed, I've called that extra condensed, and I've called that ultra condensed. And probably superficially, the letters all look the same thicknesses, but they're absolutely not. Going back to what I said that Johnston's capital I was at a ratio of 1 to 7, width to height, my bottom one is actually 10 to 1 to get it to work. Now you'd normally think, well, why isn't that light? And it's not light because the letters are so much narrower and the spacing still has to be adhered to. So I would still regard all of those as medium. They're just different versions of condensed. So that's what we ended up with. I've now gone on to my 4th D of deliver. Having explained to you that the side blinds are an amalgam of the route number and the place name, as it happens, there are, I think, 27 or 28 routes in London that have Aldwych as a turning point. That doesn't mean it's the end of the route, because a lot of buses don't go from end to end. If they're running late or whatever, they'll turn them short. So Aldwych occurs on so many of them that although I only had to do an artwork for Aldwych once for the front, for the sides I've had to do 27 different ones. And where you bear in mind that there's over 780 bus routes in London with unique numbers or alphanumeric designations, I've ended up with, I think, around about 6,000 side displays and about 1,600 fronts, and getting on for 800 route numbers. Nearly finished. I haven't quite finished it yet. So that just gives you an idea of it. And I've just put at the top, I've put a little bit of red around it, because as I was saying at the beginning, this is so out of context. You're looking at white lettering on a black background in a lit room. In reality, there's a load of red all around this, which is the bus. Red is a very distracting colour, and it actually doesn't harmonise with black at all. They're really not happy bedfellows. So I'll reiterate what I'm telling you here. This is all very out of context. So at the top, Aldwych is in standard medium. 168 there is in my slightly condensed, and all the others are medium down the bottom. Just have a quick look at the 11, but we'll come back to that because that might surprise you. I'm not going to tell you that.
Just before we go on, it's just probably worth just mentioning, in case that people here don't realise, there's a reason why the route number is on the right, on the front line.
Right, yes, that's a fair point. Not on Route Masters. That's the only thing they got wrong on the Route Master, in my view. Yeah, when you're standing on the pavement and there's a queue of buses coming towards you, and they all turn up together, you can see the front of the first one, but it's not very easy to see the ones behind. So the route number is put over on the near side by the pavement, so you've got a better chance of seeing the route number, because actually the route number is probably the most important single fact you want when your bus is turning up. That's the one thing you probably know which bus route you're trying to get on by that point in the information chain. Yes, it's a good point, John, thank you. But typography, as I said, is only part of the problem. That's a very nicely preserved bus that's in the London Transport Museum collection. It dates from, depending on how you measure it, just before the First World War. And that's a fairly typical display on the front of the bus. You can see the box that's got the 11 on it. Actually, on a modern bus, it's not much bigger. And here we are nearly 100 years, actually more than 100 years later, and we're still copying what we did then. And if you look at all the bus evolution right through, the route number box has never been big enough. You can see on there's an example of hand-painted letters for all the via points and the Shepherd's Bush destination at the top. Even in here it's quite difficult to read. It's not wide enough, that's why.
The most legible thing about that is the brand of matches, isn't it?
Right, so here we go. This is where we start to hit problems. The black areas there are the visual area of the blind box for the route number on the front and the back of a bus. So that black is the whole of what you can see before you get surrounded by red. My pink line is the diktat that I have to work to. That's the maximum area that the route number is allowed to fit. Because if you think about it, the blind box is set back from the front of the bus, which is another problem. Quite often they're at least 6 inches back from the front of the glass. So you've got all that reflection and it's set back. So not on some of the latest buses, but somewhere on the earlier ones, the actual vehicle side actually protrudes out. This is set back, a bit like our eyes are. So that's why I can't use the full extent of the black. And you can see that 149, which isn't a particularly difficult number, medium and condensed still don't fit, and I had to go to extra condensed to get it to fit. The ultra condensed isn't necessary, and that's only because there's a 1 in it, which doesn't take up much space. And even a simple number like 44 won't fit. So that's had to have condensed use. So DDA guidelines, one big problem. Bus design, other big problem. They both need addressing. This is something I mocked up just because I got quite angry one day about all this. Clearly the one on the right is not real. What I've done there is I've made the route number box a lot wider than on a standard bus. The overall display area is much wider. You can see, compare it with one on the left. And just for devilment, I've put the final destination, St Raphael's Estate, in capitals. I'll come on to why that may or may not be a good thing, but when something's in an enclosed rectangle, actually capitals fit better, but you lose the shape recognition. If you went to upper and lowercase, it would get a lot smaller, which I'll show you in a minute. But what I've also done is next to the 224, there's a series of place names which are various points along the route that the bus is going to go through. Now, buses up until not many years ago used to have via points. They've stopped putting them on now, partly for very sound reasons. Because we're dealing with roller blinds, you can't have realistically all those via points set in both directions, because when the bus turns around, they're all the wrong way around, so they don't bother. So for one direction they're fine, for the other direction they're not fine. So the argument was they used to have via points on the side of the bus as well. They've done away with those as well, because quite rightly, for half the route, that one via point will be where the bus has already gone. And it was confusing the hell out of people, thinking that's where they were going to go to, where it had already gone through there, so they got rid of that. So in other words, here's a problem, we just chuck it away. If we can have properly designed electronic displays, and we're getting there, the technology's not there yet, but every route number and every destination in London could be on every bus in London, and every time a route changes, and believe me, it happens far more often than anybody who's not in the transport industry realises, McKenna's are forever making new blinds. I'm doing new ones from them every week. That's how often they change. It would be possible to have everything on every bus. And once they're equipped, if you wanted to load some new destinations on, upload it to the bus and off you go. We're experimenting with one vehicle at the moment, and the technology is not right. They're barking up the wrong tree in my view, but it is actually possible to do it. I've done the displays. They go to a company in Slovenia who go like that, and it ends up on the front of the bus, and it's all a bit magic when you're standing there watching this going on. But the real issue is the DDA guidelines are causing a lot of problems, and the design of the bus isn't right either. And it's something I really wish the bus industry would come to grips with. To TfL's Transport for London's credit, they will have nothing to do with dot matrix indicators, and I applaud them for it, because the legibility of them is terrible, but they're cheap and they're easy to maintain, and you don't have to worry about printing roller blinds, and that's why outside London you'll almost see them everywhere.
Doug, sorry, can I just, my understanding here, you're the one on the right, which you said is a mock-up.
Yeah.
Is that a mock-up to demonstrate what, if you had free range on the design of the bus,
what could be done?
What could be done?
Yes,
so what you're doing there is demonstrating how the space could be used.
Yes.
To better effect.
Yeah,
okay.
and what I didn't add is, of course, all those via points, if it was electronic, as the bus progressed, the displays could change and it would just ditch the ones that are in the past. It will happen. I don't think it's going to be that far off, but it's not ready yet.
Can I just point out, on the one on the right, you're assuming that everything's on the plane of the front of the bus.
Yeah.
Whereas the actual one on the left shows, as you exactly said, everything is set back.
Yes, it's set back and it's curved. Yeah. The reflection causes a hell of... If you try photographing a bus in any light and be able to read the whole display, there will always be a bit of it where a reflection's going to muck it up. And we're expected to read these things while it's moving, which is why the typography is quite important.
Why don't you use non-reflective glass?
Well, again, I do know somebody who's working on this. He's not prepared to tell me what he's come up with yet. You can't use frosted glass because that would reduce the legibility.
No, you can use non-reflective.
But there's all sorts of issues like putting a bus through a bus wash, which can affect any kind of coating that you put on the glass. It's not that straightforward. It will get solved, but not by me.
So I think it's also, just before we go on, to TfL's credit, they've insisted that 38 is on a single blind.
Yes.
Because you can go all over the country and find people who try to economise by having two parallel blinds, change the digits individually. They're always misaligned.
Oh, they're awful. I don't
need
need convincing of that.
It ends up saying 318 because the light is coming through between. I mean,
yes.
Whatever TfL's shortcomings are,
yeah,
they are as nothing compared with what you can see in the
I couldn't agree with you more, but we could talk about this for 4 hours. Right, let's just go through some examples of things that I'm doing, which I hope are making things a bit easier for people. It's very easy, because the one is largely a vertical stroke, and where Edward Johnston was very clever was he introduced that chamfer at the top, so that it doesn't look like an eye or anything else. It's a sort of a mock serif, if you like. It's quite a clever device, but it's ever so tempting, and I'm afraid McKenna's were doing it all the time, is putting them far too close together. Again, I keep labouring the point, we're looking at all of this out of context, but the 11 on the right, in my view, is much easier to read, and there'll be other examples of it here. Funnily enough, I saw one of my 2 11s on the way here this evening. You can make up your own mind, you might think I'm talking nonsense, but I believe the 211 on the right is far easier to read than the one on the left in the context of a bus. Now, in normal typography, if anybody's ever done typesetting and they've tried to do tabular work, like reporting accounts or timetables, you'll find that of the 10 digits, that they're all pretty much the same width in most typefaces, except the one, which is clearly a lot narrower. And when a typeface has been designed properly and digitised properly, and that's a very big subject in its own right because a lot of them are not, to get numbers to line up in a column for pounds, shillings and pence or timetables or whatever, the one really does need an awful lot of care, otherwise it all looks, when you're looking down the column, it's all doing this and it makes it quite difficult to read it. But one needs a lot more care and attention than people ever give it credit. Another thing that that I've struggled with this, and I came to the conclusion that looking at a lot of typefaces that there actually isn't a solution, and that is what we call a word space as opposed to a letter space. A word space is the space, unsurprisingly, between two words, not between the two letters. Now, you can be clever when you're digitising a typeface and have different widths of them, but unless you know what you're doing, you can do it on the keyboard, but most people don't, and they just press the space bar and leave it at that. Where you get something like St Paul's, where you've got a full stop after the T, followed by a word space, the gap is much too wide to the P. And what I've done on the bottom one, as you can see, is I've reduced it quite notably between the dot and the P. I've also slightly taken out space between the L and the apostrophe on the S on the bottom one. Again, you might think, well, this doesn't matter. And probably it doesn't matter critically, but it all just makes reading that little bit easier. And especially if you're reading a book, that's when it really does matter, because you're taking in the shape of the word. You're just looking at one word here, so it's actually, unless you're blind, I would think everybody can read both of those. When you reduce spacing between two letters, it's called kerning, and it's a word that's very widely misunderstood. People seem to think kerning is anything where you take space out or add it. When you add it, that is not kerning. Kerning is only when you remove space between two letters. And I found this on the internet a couple of years ago, and it amused me enormously. What happens when you get an R followed by an N and it's too closely spaced? And somebody's done a mock dictionary definition of it, which I thought was very good. I really liked that.
TfL policy to retain full stop for abbreviation.
I don't think they have any policies, John. I got their database of all their destinations to work from when I started this. There's so many inconsistencies and discrepancies. I spoke to Leon about it, and he said, do what you like. And I've tried to make them consistent where I can. You can't always.
Your choice, not
yeah. Right, so we come back to DDA going on about height. 125 millimetres minimum cap height, preference is 150 if it can be done. McKenna's have been, because they're well-meaning people and because most people think that the be-all and end-all is make it as big as possible, so they've been largely using 150 mil, which in old money is 6 inches, which is what's at the top. And it doesn't fit very well, so they took the letter spacing out and squashed the letters. The bottom one is my condensed, which is correctly letter spaced and smaller. Now, in this room, you probably all think the top one's fine, but again, out in the context of in the street, and the thing's moving and you're reading it in a hurry, the letter spacing is far more important than the height. And going back to bookwork, which I can't get involved in here, but quite often, books are hard to read because there's not enough space in between the lines, which is called leading, and it's often better to make the actual point size, the size of the letters, a little bit smaller and have a bit more line spacing, the leading. And bigger isn't always better. It can be, but often it can be very detrimental. When I started doing this, I was sending all the displays I was creating to Leon just to get his approval, and he was saying, yeah, it's fine, fine. Just get on with it, you don't need to send me these. And then one came up quite early on, which is this one here. Leon quite rightly said to me, this is a hugely confusing destination. It's actually on Route 341, and Angel Road is actually, does everybody know the Victoria line? It's right up at the top end of it near Northumberland Park. North of Tottenham is where Angel Road superstores are. Unfortunately, the 341 also goes to the Angel Islington. Yes, you can see where this could start to go horribly wrong. And Leon said to me, I want you to get rid of that. I don't want that. I said, all right, fine, what do you want? And he said, I want Northumberland Park, Angel Road Superstores. Well, I'm not going to get that one. Because one of the other DDA guidelines, which I didn't show you, they don't dictate this, but there seems to be a slavish adherence that all destinations should be on one line, which in my view is nonsense. And I said to him, well, it obviously isn't going to go on one line. Well, what would you do? So I'll just show you through. Right, no, don't laugh. That top one is actually DDA compliant. It's all the right size. The one underneath, I've reduced the point size of Northumberland Park, and it's now not DDA compliant because those blue lines are the size, the height that the lettering is supposed to be. So that's now not 125mm tall. And Angel Road Superstores is still very small, and I think the whole thing is unacceptably too small to read. So there were two options. Now, it's been said that we mustn't use capitals because they're too hard to read, and we mustn't have two lines. Now, if you can remember back to what I was explaining to you, that you've got a P in Superstores and a G in Angel, which are descenders. And remember the point size, the size of the lettering is from the top of the capital to the bottom of the lowercase, and a little bit more as it happens. Because capitals don't have descenders, you can actually make the capital letters quite a lot bigger than you can if you have it in upper and lowercase. I said to Leon, I've sent them both to him, I said, I know which one I prefer, I don't want to prejudice you with my views. And he said to me, well, the one with capitals is clearly better. And I said, well, that's my view too. The primary destination, Northumberland Park, is the important bit. If you lose a bit of shape recognition on Angel Road Superstores, I don't think anybody's going to get on the wrong bus or go the wrong way. It's a bit of a moot point. I don't know how many people it would actually inconvenience, probably not many. His decision was, yeah, I want them done like that. And I said, you realise you're going to get a load of flack for this. McKenna's were terrified because as a responsible supplier, they thought everybody's going to moan at them, you know, you're breaking all the rules. And Leon and I, well, it was Leon, not so much me, said to them, look, I'm the client, you're producing what I'm asking you to do. If there's any flack, it comes to me, not you. I understand McKenna's point of view because I'm on the supply side of all this. And even if it isn't your fault, if you get tarred with the wrong brush, it's not ideal. But anyway, that was the decision that was being made. And they've all, wherever there's been a subsidiary name, that they've been done like that. Now, Northumberland Park doesn't have descenders, so that's quite good. So I can actually get Northumberland Park to 150mm instead of 125. Whereas if it had descenders, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, Doug, is there a presumption of understanding? And I think this is probably a typographical thing. Is there a presumption of understanding that when you've got either of these, when you've got that situation, do you understand that as meaning a single destination or two destinations?
Well, there's a school of thought that that second, the subsidiary name, in the jargon for it, is they're called qualifiers. There's a lot of people who think you shouldn't have them at all. That's not my decision. My job has been to produce these displays.
Clearly the brief you had was a single destination.
No, I've got to set that name.
No. The brief was, this is a single destination.
Yeah.
Northumberland Park and the Angel Road Superstore on Northumberland Park, so it's one destination.
Yes, correct.
And that is how it is intended to be interpreted.
Yes, correct. There are a number of other places where you get more than one variant of the primary name. Chris sitting up the back will probably know far better than I do, but there are lots of them. I mean, I think Ilford is a classic example. There's about 5 different versions of Ilford.
Yeah,
where Ilford's the primary name.
Well, I'm just wondering here, I don't know whether this is true or not, it just occurs to me you could possibly interpret, when you see that, you interpret that differently. Perhaps as Northumberland Park, I don't know, via Angel Road Superstores.
Mike, there is a classic one near me, which is London buses insisted upon it. Blackheath is a very large area in South East London. The station Blackheath is in a stretch of road called Blackheath Village, which is what people call the area around that station. It's Blackheath Village. Eventually, they have now changed it to read Blackheath Village. The route actually goes through Blackheath Royal Standard, down to Greenwich and back to Blackheath Village. So it's incredibly confusing.
If there's one thing
it is now a lot better.
If there's one thing I've learned in information design, there is no solution that everybody's happy with, and there's no end of the way you think, how on earth did you come to that conclusion when you looked at that? I'm fascinated by how people reason on many occasions, and what you've said is probably one of a dozen different ways that people read into that.
Well, I read it that
the top one, they relate to each other, the bottom one doesn't.
No, that's another way of looking at it.
Mm.
So here we've got three versions of it. It's one place, it's a via point, or they're two different places.
Unfortunately, anybody who knew where Angel Road Superstores was anyway.
For a habitual traveller, you don't need it at all.
Well, that begs the question, why isn't it Angel Road Superstores? Rather than
Well, because the other end of the route goes to the Angel Islington, that's
yeah,
why.
but Superstore is very different from Angel Islington.
This, I hope, just explains the use of height. The top line and the bottom, these two are the same point size, typographically. Doesn't matter what point size, as it happens, it's 72 point, but it's blown up on this screen anyway. But you can see how the upper and lowercase letters look much smaller. Because you've got the descenders, the overall height in the caps and the upper and lower is the same. Whereas here, what I've done is you can see these are the same point size as each other, and by using capitals, you can see it's using up a lot less height, and I can actually make them bigger on the bus blind, doing it that way. Whereas if I had to use upper and lowercase for those qualifiers, it would get a lot smaller. So yes, you gain the shape recognition, but you lose the size. Everything's a trade-off with this sort of thing. Now, yes, that top one is entirely DDA compliant. I think it's awful, personally. It's on a route that runs quite near where I live. That Cranbourne Road industrial estate is hideously squashed, and the letter space has been taken out. Potter's Bar has been squashed, and the letter spacing has been taken out. But it's big. The bottom one is the way I've ended up doing it, and I've actually got Potter's Bar. You can't really see it on this screen. It is actually slightly bigger. Personally, I think the bottom one is easier for most people to read on a bus coming at you from a distance. The Cranbourne Road industrial estate is almost illegible on a bus.
If you know the location, industrial estate is redundant anyway. It's not a very long road.
Here's another one. Top one, DDA compliant. This is a side blind. We've had to use condensed for the route number. We've had to use condensed for the main place name, and we've had to use condensed and squashed and reduced letter spacing for Temple Mills Lane. Whereas on the bottom one, everything's in medium, and it's all occupying the same amount of space.
Doug, I presume you have a think about putting the second line in brackets as well. Don't you still the tube stations? You think about that as well?
I have to say, I've never even thought about it. I would regard that as visual clutter, personally. It doesn't really add anything. Is it really making it clearer what it is by having brackets around it, or is it just introducing another what's that? Here's another example of what we had before, Brent Park Superstores, the way I've done it.
So we've split it on two lines then. Has it been your decision that the second line should be caps?
Yes, well that's what, as I said, I ran this when I showed that original Northumberland Park to Leon when he wanted it done that way, and his decision was the same as mine, that capitals was better. I mean, when people say capitals are harder to read, I would point out that every name board on every underground station wall has got the name in capitals.
No.
I've never heard anybody say they're hard to read.
But I don't think it's only about readability, it's also about stress, isn't it? I mean, you could interpret different things into the fact that that is caps rather than Brent Park. Brent Park is bigger, but Superstores being in caps perhaps arguably shouts at you more.
Well, I spent a lot of time on getting what I thought was the optimum size for the subsidiary in capitals. If you go even a tad bigger, it really does fight with the primary name. And if you go smaller, it starts to the balance just doesn't look right.
Yeah, but people tend to use caps mistakenly.
No, I keep going
because
on.
they want to shout at you.
Yeah, I keep going on about context. We're not looking at it in context here. Have a look at them in the street. You want to ask?
Yeah, I kind of personally feel by going to caps on the secondary location, you're losing the shape of the word.
Yes.
And therefore you're decreasing legibility.
Yes.
And, I'm squinting here.
But it would get smaller if it was in upper and lowercase, and you'd lose the legibility there.
Obviously, you're decreasing the shape of the word.
It's a compromise.
It is a compromise.
I think we're having questions before the end.
Yes.
make a point about that. One of the things that you've achieved, it seems to me, in using capitals for the qualifier line, is maintaining the relative degree of condensation of both lines.
Yes.
And the full, if you go back a slide, your option where you, no, I think there was a previous one where you showed, yes, the problem here is the extreme condensation of that qualified line. Because that's
what on the top one. Yes, yes. It's not helped by it's a ridiculously long name. That's unnecessary.
It's a very difficult one. It's a very difficult.
There's lots like that.
But in the lower one there, the degree of condensation on those caps actually helps.
Yes.
It makes it lighter.
There are some where I've got a short primary name and a long qualifier. I've actually used condensed on the qualifier when I didn't need to. It would have fitted, but it was starting to dominate the primary name.
Yes.
And this is all typography and not just get your PC, choose the font, type it out. A lot of these have had individual, what I think is love and care. Not everybody might agree. Where were we? Yes.
Sorry.
Right. This one is going to be very difficult to comprehend in this context. The 92 is the same on both. Greenford hasn't got a descender in it. Ironbridge is obviously set in caps below it. Yes, and on the one below, because Ironbridge has got a descender in the G, it's getting very close to the word Uxbridge Road. Now, in the top one, I've actually made Greenford a bit bigger than Ironbridge is in the lower one, because there's that space, because there's no descenders. It doesn't really show very well here. But in a way, if it doesn't show, that's the whole point, because I've often believed in any design, if what you've done shows, then it hasn't worked. Skill is all about it not showing. If it does show, it's usually a bodge. I don't know what people's views are on that one. I haven't got a problem with the bottom one. It's breaking all the rules of typography, but not in signage. You'd never do that in continuous text in a book, because if you look at that, the G of Totteridge is dropping down well below the cap height of Whetstone. It's in typographic terms, it's known as negative leading, which before we had computers, it wasn't possible. There were ways around it, but as it happens, this display's never been needed, but I wanted to just try it to see what happened.
So sorry, do you think you can improve legibility by actually reducing down the size of the lower one to increase the space around each of the words so you can actually read the word shape actually?
Yeah. Yes. I think the bottom one's got much better definition.
Yeah, but you could actually reduce down in size. And
why would you want to
increase the
well,
word shape?
You could, but then, yes, you could make the letters smaller and have line spacing. I don't think it needs it. When you've only got 2 or 3 words, you'd never do it in continuous text. It would be abhorrent to even think about it.
So bigger doesn't necessarily mean more legible. Smaller can mean more legible. If
I haven't got examples. We'd be going on to the A-level course if we went into that. But there are loads of situations where smaller actually is easier to read, especially in bookwork, not so much in signage.
Interestingly there, you've reduced the spacing at top and bottom compared with the ones earlier. Whereas you could have done that with some of the other ones you've illustrated, and moved slightly closer to the top and bottom.
But that isn't a primary name and a subsidiary, it's all a primary name.
Yeah,
and it's all on one line. I haven't done that anywhere. All the others that are on 2 lines is a primary name and a qualifier, and the qualifier's smaller in caps. That's just one place name.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but even so, you know, you've still gone into an area which before you sort of said is almost sacrosanct.
Yes, correct. Somebody once said rules are for the guidance of wise men and for the slavish obedience of fools. It's not original to me, but you have to understand the rules perfectly to know when to break them, because no rules can't be broken. Double negative there. But just breaking them without knowing what you're doing, that's when it all goes hideously wrong. Now, the other diktat was that the subsidiary name, the ASDA, must be centred under the primary name. These are side blinds, and in my view, the bottom one is better because I've centred ASDA under the visual space between the bottom of the capital P of Park Royal and the descender of the Y of Royal. I haven't mathematically centred it, which is what the top one is, and it just lets Asda breathe a little bit more. You know, the bus is whizzing past, especially with a moving target. The last thing you want is tight letter spacing. If anything, you want the letter spacing to be a bit loose, and that helps you because the vehicle's moving. When it's stationary, unless you've got really bad eyesight, it won't make a blind bit of difference, no pun intended.
I don't actually understand the logic there, because if it's whizzing past you, you've either missed it.
Well, when I say be at the whizzing past, yeah, but it's still useful to know the one you've just missed, and is it worth waiting for another one? So, as I said at the beginning, the bus blind is right at the end of the information chain. You've got all the information about where the bus is going to go, what time it's due, where it's going to go to. What you want to know, where am I going to get on the bus? When you get to the bus stop, you need to be able to read that information on the front. And that's why I think spacing is so important with all this. And as I say, if you can't get to sleep at night, that's my website. There's actually a much longer article with all of these illustrations in it, and also why I don't like Helvetica much.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. I think
pleasure.
judging from all of the questions